With the CodeIgniter framework installed, when we open the site in a browser, we see this page. However, if we look at the code for this page, index.php in the public folder, there's lots of PHP code, but no HTML, and certainly none of the content that we see in the browser. So what's happening? In this section, we'll find out. We'll learn the basics of MVC frameworks and how to display a page of HTML using CodeIgniter. In a traditional PHP website without a framework, you create PHP files that you request directly in the browser, with the file name in the URL. If you have files in subfolders, then you just include that subfolder before the file name as part of the URL. So the URL corresponds directly to the file structure of your web server. CodeIgniter is different. CodeIgniter is a Model View Controller or MVC framework. Instead of having your code in files that you open directly in the browser, you organize your code into models, views, and controllers. Models deal with data, for example, storing it and retrieving it from a database. Views contain the code that the user sees in the browser, for example, HTML. And controllers decide which view to load, which model to use, and so on. When a request comes in from the browser, the framework decides which controller to run based on the URL, and sends that controller's response back. So in an MVC framework, the URL doesn't correspond directly to files and folders on the web server. The index.php page in the root of the site is called a front controller. This loads the framework. This is part of the framework, so you don't need to change any of the code in here. Instead, all your code goes in the app folder and its subfolders. We'll cover what each of these subfolders is throughout the course. Let's start with controllers. In the controllers folder, let's open the home controller. This is simply a class that extends the base controller class, and it has a single public method called index. Let's remove its contents for now and replace it with a simple echo statement that prints out the message, "Hello World." In the browser, we see that message displayed. So when we go to the root of our site, the framework executes this method inside this class, and we see the results in the browser. We just printed out this message by changing the code in this controller method. We don't want to output content directly like this inside a controller though. One of the advantages of using an MVC framework is that the presentation code, for example HTML, is separated from the application code. In an MVC framework, we put presentation code in a view. Views go in the Views folder. This welcome message.php file is the page we saw when we first loaded the framework. We don't need this now, so you can safely delete it. Let's create a view for the home page of our site. Inside the Views folder, you're free to organize view files however you like. However, it's good practice to create a subfolder for each controller's views. As we're going to load this view from the home controller, we'll create a subfolder of the Views folder called Home. It's also good practice to match the name of the view file to the name of the method in the controller. our homepage method is called index. So let's create a new file called index.php. A view is just a file that contains HTML or whatever you want to send to the browser. So let's add some basic HTML in here with a doc type, a head, a body, and so on. In the controller, let's remove this echo line, and to display the view file from the controller, we call the view method, passing in the path to the file inside the views folder. This returns a string, so we can just echo that out directly. In the browser, now we see the contents of the view file we just added. The view function loads the contents of the file and returns it as a string. This function isn't part of standard PHP, it's part of the CodeIgniter framework. It's inherited from the parent controller. So when we create a controller class, by extending this base controller class, we get access to the various framework functions we need. When calling this method, the view filename extension, in this case .php, is optional, so you can remove it if you like. And in the browser, it still works. We just added a view file that's displayed when we go to the root of our site. We're loading this view and echoing its contents out in the home controller. But how does the framework know to run this controller method? The framework uses a component called a router to decide which controller and method to run based on the URL. The router contains various rules, or routes, which map URLs to controllers and methods. URLs in CodeIgniter are split into segments, separated by slashes. By default, the first segment represents the controller class, the second segment represents the method inside that class, and any other segments are arguments to that method. So on our site, if I change the URL to /home/index, it still works. Home is the controller and index is the method. We configure routes in the routes configuration file. In the app folder, in the config subfolder, this file is called routes.php. The default behavior that we just saw of the first segment being the controller, the second segment being the method, and so on, is enabled by this setting, set auto route to true. Unless you have a good reason to do so, I recommend you leave this set to true, as it means most URLs will just work without you having to add a route for each one. This is what lets us access our homepage with home/index in our URL. There are also settings here for the default controller, which is set to home, and the default method, which is set to index. So as index is the default method, we can remove this from the URL. And it still runs the index method. The same for the controller name. This is home by default, so we can remove this too. And it still runs the index method in the home controller. There's also a specific route set in here, which maps the home page, represented by a single / to the index method in the home controller. As we have the default set above, this line isn't really necessary, but having it does give a slight performance increase for the home page. We'll look at routing in more detail later on. Let's add a new controller. So we'll create a new file in the App Controllers folder. This is going to display a list of tasks, so let's call it tasks.php. Make sure you start the file name with a capital letter. We'll start by copying the code from the home controller. And pasting this in the new file. By default, controller classes are in the App Controllers namespace, so we'll leave that as it is, apart from putting it on a new line so it's clearer. We'll change the name of the class to Tasks. The PHP standard for class names is to start them with a capital letter, and as we created the file with the same name as the class, this file will be loaded automatically when we first use it. In the index method, it will show the home index view. So if we go to /tasks/index in the browser, we see the home index view. Let's add a view for the tasks index. First, we'll create a subfolder in the App Views folder that matches the name of the controller, tasks. Then we'll create a new file in here called index.php. For the content, let's copy the HTML from the home index view and paste it in the new file. For now, we'll simply change the content of the header element to tasks. Then, in the tasks controller, we'll change this line so we're displaying the tasks index view instead. In the browser, now we see the content from the tasks index view file. The framework has routed this URL to the new controller and run this method. Also, as we saw earlier, index is the default action, so we can remove index from the URL, and this works as well. At the moment, we have two views, one for the tasks index and one for the home index. We're repeating ourselves though with the top part of this code, the doc type, head section and opening body tag. Repetition like this isn't a good idea, as if we ever want to change this section, we need to do it in more than one place. So let's extract this out to a separate view file. First we'll copy this, then we'll create a new file in the App Views folder and call it header.php. Note how this isn't in a subfolder of the Views folder, and we'll paste the code we just copied in here. In the home index file, we can now remove this header code and then in the home controller, we're already printing out the contents of the index file. To output the header, we'll call the view function again passing in the path to the header view we just created. In the browser, the home page looks the same, and the source includes all the HTML as before, only now we split it up into two files. This is one way to deal with repeated view code, calling the view function multiple times in a controller method like this. This was common in earlier versions of CodeIgniter. It does mean the controller code is somewhat bloated though, and you have to remember to include the header wherever you display a view. Another way to include common code would be to include one view inside another. For example, here in the tasks index, we still have the header code. Let's delete this and include the header view here directly. Rather than just a regular PHP include, we do this using CodeIgniter's include method, which means we can access any CodeIgniter functions inside the included view if necessary. So let's add a call to that method, passing in the path to the file we want to include. In the browser, if we go to the tasks index, the file is shown as before, including the header. This technique is fine if you want to include a view file on some pages, but not on others. For code that's shared among every page though, it's not ideal, as again you have to remember to include it in every single view. Calling the view function more than once in the controller also isn't ideal, as we just saw. With the latest version of CodeIgniter, there's a better way to do this. If you have view code that's common to all pages, or view code that's common to a group of several pages, then the simplest way to avoid repeating this code is to use a view layout. View layouts allow us to create views that we can extend, much like a class extending another. So we can have a base view that contains common code, and any view that wants to include this common code simply extends the layout view. Let's create a view layout that includes this common header code. First, let's create a subfolder of the views folder called Layouts. It isn't required that view templates are put in this folder, but it's good practice to keep the views folder organized. In here, let's create a new file and call it default.php. You can call view templates whatever you like. In the header view that we created earlier, let's copy this code and paste it in the new layout file. Let's also add the code that's common at the end of each view, the closing body tag and closing HTML tag. To make this into a template, we add one or more sections. To display a section, we call the render section method, passing in the name of the section. The name is a simple string and can be whatever you like. I've called this one content. Now we can use this layout in an existing view. For example, here in the home index view. To use a view layout, we call the extend method at the top, passing in the path to the view template inside the views folder. Then, all content in a view that extends a layout needs to be inside a section. We enclose content inside a section by calling the section method before it passing in the name of the section, which I called content, and the end section method after it. We don't need to pass in the name of the section when we end it, as the code knows which section we're ending. As the layout includes these closing tags, we can safely remove them. Finally, in the home controller, we can remove this line where we're echoing out the header file, as the header code is now part of the layout. In the browser, the home page works as before, with the header and end closing tags where they should be. So the individual view is much simpler, and we only need one view call in the controller. Let's add another section to the view layout we just created. You can have as many sections as you need. We want the title to be different on each page. So let's replace this hard-coded title with a section called title. Then, in the home index file, to add content for this section, first we call the section function as before, passing in the name of the section, in this case title, then the content we want in that section, which is the string home, and then the end section function. You can call the functions on the same line like this, or on separate lines as below, depending on the content of the section. In the browser, the title of the page is now set by the section we just added. Let's change the tasks index to use this layout too. First, let's remove this line where we're including the header and also the closing tags at the bottom. Then we can copy the first 3 lines of the home index view and paste them at the top of the tasks index. Let's change the content of the title section, and then we just call end section at the end to end the content section. In the browser, now if we go to the tasks index, we see the title we just added, and the content is included inside the layout code. Using a view layout is the simplest way to include common code in several views. Now we're not using this header file anymore, we can delete it. One final thing we need to do in the controllers is to return the content instead of printing it out directly using echo. It's not good practice to print out content directly like this from a controller. Instead, we'll return it, and the framework will take charge of outputting it. Likewise, in the tasks controller, we'll change this echo to return. We'll see later on how we can return different types of response and not just content. And in the browser, nothing has changed. The view that we load from the controller is still displayed.